Have you ever looked at a photograph and wondered if the image captured more than just a moment in time? What if it captured something unseen, something that shouldn't be there? My name is Michael Carter, and I was once a man who believed that a photograph was just a picture, nothing more, nothing less. That was before I found the roll of film that changed everything. It all started on a dreary Tuesday morning. The sky was a muted gray, and the rain pattered against my studio windows like the steady tapping of an anxious heart. I had just finished a mundane photo shoot, a family portrait, nothing exciting. My studio was small, tucked away on a quiet street in the city, and business had been slow. After the clients left, I noticed an old roll of film on my workbench. I didn't remember seeing it before, but I had a habit of keeping old film, never knowing when I might want to experiment with it. Curious, I decided to develop the film, hoping it might contain something interesting from a forgotten project. The darkroom had always been my sanctuary, a place where the world outside faded away, leaving only the gentle rhythm of the chemicals and the anticipation of the images slowly coming to life. I went through the usual process, my hands moving automatically, my mind wandering. But as the first image began to appear, I froze. The photograph was of an empty street, one I recognized as being near my studio. But in the center of the frame was a figure, a man, standing in the middle of the road, staring directly at the camera. I leaned in closer, my breath catching in my throat. The man's eyes were hollow, his expression one of sheer terror. But it wasn't just his face that unsettled me, it was the fact that I knew, without a doubt, that the street had been empty when I took that photo. I shook off the initial shock and continued developing the rest of the roll, my hands trembling slightly. Each photo that emerged was stranger than the last. In every image, there were people, figures that hadn't been there when I took the shots. They varied in appearance, a woman in a flowing dress standing in a deserted park, an elderly man sitting on a bench that had been empty moments before. But it wasn't just their sudden appearance that disturbed me, it was their expressions. Each face was twisted in fear, pain, or despair, as if the camera had captured the precise moment of their deaths. I spent the rest of the day staring at those photos, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe it was a trick of the light, a flaw in the film. But deep down, I knew there was no logical explanation. Something supernatural was at play. That night, I locked the photos away in a drawer, trying to convince myself that it was just a strange coincidence. But as I lay in bed, sleep eluding me, I couldn't shake the feeling that those figures were still watching me, waiting for something. The following days were a blur of confusion and anxiety. I couldn't focus on my work, couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. My thoughts kept drifting back to the photos, to the haunted faces of those mysterious figures. I had to know who they were, had to understand why they had appeared in my images. I started by researching the locations where the photos had been taken. I scoured old newspapers, searched online archives, even visited the spots in person, hoping to find some clue, some connection. But I found nothing, no reports of accidents, no missing persons, nothing that could explain the haunted faces in my photos. As my obsession grew, so did my paranoia. I started seeing the faces everywhere, in my dreams, in the reflections of windows, even in the shadows cast by the flickering streetlights outside my apartment. I felt like I was being watched, followed, haunted by the ghosts I had unwittingly captured on film. One evening, while working late in the darkroom, I thought I heard a whisper. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it sent a chill down my spine. I stopped what I was doing, straining to hear. The room was silent, the only sound the steady drip of water from the developing tray. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. A shadow, shifting in the corner of the room, just outside the reach of the dim red light. My heart raced as I turned, but there was nothing there. Just the shelves of chemicals and equipment, the dark walls closing in around me. I shook my head, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination, the result of too many sleepless nights and too much time spent in the darkroom. But the feeling of being watched remained, growing stronger with each passing day. One evening, after another fruitless day of searching, I returned to my studio, exhausted and on edge. As I stepped inside, I noticed something was different. The air was colder, the shadows deeper. And then I saw him, the man from the first photograph, standing in the corner of the room, his hollow eyes locked onto mine. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at me with that same look of terror. I wanted to run, to scream, but I couldn't move. It was as if I was rooted to the spot, trapped by his gaze. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. The room was empty, but the chill remained, a lingering reminder that what I had seen was real. That night, I knew I couldn't keep this to myself any longer. I needed help, someone who could explain what was happening to me, someone who could make sense of the impossible. I reached out to an old friend, Dr. Emily Graves, a professor of paranormal studies at the local university. We hadn't spoken in years, but I knew she was the only person who might be able to help me. When I showed her the photos, her reaction was one of both fascination and concern. She examined them carefully, noting the details of each figure, their expressions, the way they seemed to be interacting with their surroundings despite not being there when the photos were taken. "These are spirits, Michael," she said, her voice steady but filled with an underlying tension. "Ghosts, caught in their final moments before death. The camera somehow captured their pain, their fear. It's as if the film acted as a bridge between our world and theirs." Her words sent a shiver down my spine. I had always been a skeptic, never one to believe in the supernatural. But the evidence was right in front of me, there was no denying it. Emily suggested that the spirits might be trying to communicate with me, to reveal the truth about their deaths. "You need to find out who they were," she said. "Their souls might be trapped, unable to move on because of some unresolved issue. If you can uncover the truth, maybe you can help them find peace." Determined to get to the bottom of this mystery, I started with the man from the first photograph. I returned to the street where the photo had been taken, hoping to find some clue, some trace of his existence. As I walked the length of the street, something caught my eye, a small plaque on the side of a building, commemorating the life of a man named Jonathan Reed. According to the plaque, he had died in a hit-and-run accident on that very street nearly 20 years ago. I felt a chill run down my spine. Could this be the man from my photograph? The more I thought about it, the more certain I became. The terrified expression on his face, the way he had appeared in the middle of the road, it all made sense. But why had he appeared in my photo now, after so many years? And what did he want from me? My investigation into Jonathan Reed's death revealed a dark truth. He had been hit by a car while crossing the street late at night. The driver had never been caught, and the case had gone cold, leaving his family without closure. But as I dug deeper, I discovered something even more disturbing. Jonathan Reed wasn't just a random victim, he had been targeted. He had been investigating a local gang involved in illegal activities, and they had silenced him to keep him from exposing their crimes. The more I learned, the more I realized that Jonathan's spirit was seeking justice. He had been denied the chance to see his killer brought to justice, and his soul couldn't rest until the truth was revealed. With this newfound knowledge, I returned to Emily, who suggested a risky course of action. "If you can confront the person responsible for Jonathan's death," she said, "you might be able to free his spirit." As I delved deeper into Jonathan Reed's life, the visions began. At first, they were fleeting, a flash of an image here, a disembodied whisper there, but they quickly grew more intense. I would be walking down the street, and suddenly the world around me would shift. The colors would drain from the buildings, the people would blur, and I would find myself standing in the middle of the road, just as Jonathan had on the night of his death. In these visions, I could see the car hurtling toward me, feel the cold wind against my skin, hear the screech of tires and the sickening thud of metal against flesh. But just before impact, I would snap back to reality, my heart racing, sweat dripping down my face. I knew that these visions were more than just hallucinations. They were memories, Jonathan's memories, imprinted on the film and now bleeding into my mind. He was trying to show me what had happened to him, trying to lead me to the truth. The next few days were a blur of investigation and planning. I managed to track down the man who had been driving the car that night, an old, bitter man who had never paid for his crime. Confronting him wasn't easy, but I knew I had to do it. When I finally faced him, I told him everything I had learned, showed him the photograph, and demanded that he confess. At first, he denied it, but as I pressed him, his facade crumbled. He admitted to the hit and run, his voice shaking with guilt and fear. "I was drunk," he said, his eyes downcast. "I didn't mean to kill him. I've regretted it every day since, but I was too much of a coward to come forward." With his confession, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. I knew that Jonathan's spirit would finally be at peace. But as I left the man's house, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The shadows seemed to move of their own accord, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. I knew that Jonathan's story was just the beginning, and that the other spirits were growing impatient. The more I learned, the more I realized that helping Jonathan had only opened the door to something much darker. The other spirits weren't satisfied. They wanted their stories told as well, their deaths avenged. One by one, I began to investigate the other figures in the photographs. Each case was more disturbing than the last. A woman who had been murdered by her lover, an elderly man who had died alone and forgotten in a nursing home, a young girl who had been the victim of a terrible accident. With each revelation, the spirits grew more restless, their presence in my life more intrusive. They began to appear not just in my dreams, but in my waking life as well. I saw them in mirrors, heard their whispers in the silence of my studio. One night, I awoke to find the woman from the park standing at the foot of my bed. Her eyes were hollow, her dress stained with blood. She didn't speak, just stared at me with an expression of utter despair. I knew then that I wasn't over my head. The spirits were no longer just seeking justice, they were seeking something more, something I couldn't give. My obsession with the photographs consumed me. I stopped taking on new clients, stopped leaving my apartment, stopped sleeping. All I could think about were the spirits, their tortured faces, their desperate need for closure. But no matter how many truths I uncovered, it was never enough. The spirits kept coming, their numbers growing with each passing day. I was being haunted by an army of the dead, each one demanding something from me that I couldn't give. Emily tried to help, but even she was at a loss. "You've opened a door that can't be closed," she told me, her voice heavy with sorrow. "These spirits are drawn to you now. They see you as their only hope, their only chance at redemption." But I wasn't sure how much more I could take. The constant presence of the spirits, their unrelenting demands, it was driving me to the brink of madness. I retreated into the darkroom, hoping to find some solace in the familiar process of developing photos. But even there, the spirits found me. The red light seemed to flicker, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The chemicals smelled stronger, more acrid, burning my nostrils. As I worked, I began to hear whispers again, soft at first, but growing louder, more insistent. There were voices, dozens of them, all speaking at once, their words a jumbled mess of desperation and anger. I tried to block them out, focusing on the photos in front of me, but it was no use. The voices grew louder, the shadows deeper, until I couldn't take it anymore. I dropped the photos and stumbled out of the darkroom, gasping for air. When I looked back at the photos, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The images had changed, no longer just the haunted figures, but now twisted, grotesque versions of them. Their faces were distorted, their eyes black holes, their mouths open in silent screams. I knew then that I couldn't escape them. They had taken over my life, and there was nothing I could do to stop them. The spirits began to haunt me relentlessly. They appeared in every shadow, every reflection, their hollow eyes following me wherever I went. I would wake up in the middle of the night to find them standing at the foot of my bed, their cold, clammy hands reaching out to me. I stopped sleeping altogether, too afraid to close my eyes. But even in my waking hours, I could feel their presence, could hear their whispers in the back of my mind. They were always there, always watching, always waiting. I started seeing things that weren't there, faces in the walls, bloodstains on the floors, doors that opened and closed on their own. My apartment became a prison, a place where the line between reality and nightmare had blurred beyond recognition. I knew that I was losing my mind, but I couldn't stop. The spirits had taken hold of me, and they weren't going to let go. My descent into madness was swift and unforgiving. I stopped eating, stopped taking care of myself. My once tidy apartment became a mess of discarded food containers, dirty clothes, and scattered photographs. The spirits grew bolder, their appearances more frequent, more terrifying. They no longer just stood and watched, they began to interact with me, touching me, whispering in my ear, sometimes even screaming. I started hearing things, scratching sounds coming from the walls, faint cries echoing through the halls. The air grew thick with the stench of decay, and the shadows seemed to pulse with a life of their own. I knew that I was losing control, that the spirits were winning. But I couldn't stop myself. I was drawn to the photos, to the darkroom, to the very thing that was destroying me. One night, in the depths of my despair, I found myself in the darkroom once more, surrounded by the eerie glow of the red light. The whispers had returned, but this time they were clearer, more distinct. "Michael," they called, their voices echoing in the small room. "Michael, we need you." I was terrified, but something inside me urged me to listen, to follow their voices. I picked up the latest photo I had developed and held it under the light. It was the image of the elderly man I had seen in the park, a figure that had haunted me for weeks. But as I stared at the photo, I noticed something strange. The background of the image, which had once been a clear shot of the park, had changed. Now, it was a twisted, dark version of the park, the trees gnarled and twisted, the sky a deep, unnatural red. And in the distance, I could see something moving, something that wasn't there before. It was a figure, slowly emerging from the shadows, walking towards the camera. My hands trembled as I watched the figure grow closer, its features becoming more distinct. It was the elderly man, but he looked different now. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, his skin pale and stretched over his bones. But what terrified me most was the expression on his face. It wasn't one of fear or despair, it was one of anger, of hatred. And as he came closer, I realized that he wasn't just walking towards the camera. He was walking towards me. The more I stared at the photograph, the more I felt a connection to the man within it, a connection that went beyond the image, beyond the camera. It was as if our lives had become intertwined, our fates bound together by something dark and ancient. I began to experience his memories, flashes of his life, his pain, his suffering. I saw him sitting alone in his decrepit apartment, surrounded by the remnants of a life long forgotten. I felt his loneliness, his despair, his desperation for someone to remember him, to acknowledge his existence. And then, I saw his death, slow, painful, alone. A heart attack that left him gasping for breath, his frail body collapsing onto the cold, hard floor. He had died with no one around, no one to mourn him, no one to even notice that he was gone. His spirit had been trapped, wandering the earth, searching for someone to remember him, to validate his existence. And now, he had found me. But his connection to me wasn't just about remembrance. There was something darker at play, something that tied us together in ways I couldn't understand. The camera, the photographs, they were more than just tools of the supernatural. They were a gateway, a conduit between the living and the dead. As the days passed, I became more and more obsessed with the darkroom. It had become my sanctuary, the only place where I felt truly connected to the spirits. But it was also a place of fear, a place where the line between reality and nightmare had blurred beyond recognition. I began to notice changes in the darkroom, subtle at first, but growing more pronounced with each visit. The walls seemed to close in around me, the air grew colder, and the red light flickered ominously. The chemicals took on a sickly, rotting smell, and the water in the developing trays was tinged with a dark, viscous substance that reminded me of blood. And then there were the shadows, always shifting, always moving, just beyond the reach of the light. I could see them out of the corner of my eye, could feel their cold, clammy touch on my skin. They were the spirits, watching me, waiting for something. One night, as I worked in the darkroom, the shadows grew bolder. They moved closer, surrounding me, their whispering voices filling the room. I could feel their presence, their anger, their desperation. And then, as I reached for a photograph, I felt a hand grab my wrist. It was cold, clammy, and impossibly strong. I gasped, trying to pull away, but the grip tightened, pulling me closer to the shadows. The voices grew louder, more insistent. Michael. Michael, you must help us. You must free us. I knew then that the spirits were no longer just haunting me, they were trying to possess me, to use me as a vessel for their revenge. Desperate for answers, I turned to the only source I had left, my own past. I began to dig through old family records, searching for any connection to the spirits, any clue that might explain why they had chosen me. What I found was a history of darkness, of secrets long buried and forgotten. My family had been cursed, haunted by tragedy for generations. There were stories of mysterious deaths, of accidents that couldn't be explained, of disappearances that had never been solved. But the most disturbing discovery was that of my grandfather, Henry Carter, a man whose name I had never heard before, a man whose existence had been erased from the family's history. Henry Carter had been a photographer, just like me. He had owned a small studio, not unlike mine, and had been known for his work with film. But his life had ended in tragedy, found dead in his car on the very street where I had taken that first photograph. His death had been ruled an accident, but there were whispers of something darker, whispers that Henry had been involved in something sinister, something that had led to his death. As I delved deeper into his life, I discovered that Henry had been obsessed with the supernatural. He had been fascinated by the idea of capturing spirits on film, of using his camera as a tool to connect with the dead. And then I found it, a photograph, hidden away in an old box of his belongings. It was a picture of a street, eerily similar to the one where he had died. And in the center of the frame was a figure, a man, standing in the middle of the road, staring directly at the camera. It was the same man from my photograph, the man who had set off this entire chain of events. But how could he be in a photo taken decades before I was born? And why did he look exactly the same? The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, revealing a horrifying truth. The spirits I had been seeing, the figures in the photographs, they weren't just random people. They were all connected to my family, to my past. My grandfather, Henry, had been the first to capture these spirits on film. He had discovered something dark, something that had cursed our family for generations. The camera, the photographs, they were more than just tools of the supernatural. They were a curse, passed down from one generation to the next, trapping the spirits of the dead and binding them to our family. And now, I was the latest victim of that curse. The spirits weren't just haunting me, they were trying to possess me, to use me as a vessel to escape their torment. But there was something else, something even more terrifying. The man in the photograph, the figure who had appeared in both mine and my grandfather's photos, he wasn't just another spirit. He was something darker, something more powerful. He was the one who had started it all, the one who had cursed our family. And now, he was coming for me. With the truth finally revealed, I knew what I had to do. I couldn't keep running, couldn't keep trying to solve the mysteries of the past. I had to confront the spirits head-on, to face whatever it was they wanted from me. I returned to the street where it had all started, the place where my grandfather had died. It was late at night, the air thick with tension. I could feel their presence all around me, could see their faces in the shadows. I stood in the middle of the road, just as my grandfather had done all those years ago, and waited. The silence was deafening, the darkness suffocating. And then, one by one, they appeared, the spirits, surrounding me, their hollow eyes locked onto mine. For a moment, I was terrified, certain that they would drag me down into their world, never to return. But then something unexpected happened. One of the spirits stepped forward, Jonathan Reed, the man from the first photograph. He looked at me with a sadness that pierced my soul, and then he spoke. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You freed us." And just like that, they were gone. The street was empty, the night silent once more. I stood there for a long time, trying to make sense of what had just happened. In the weeks that followed, I tried to return to my normal life, but I knew that I would never be the same. The photographs, the spirits, the dark secrets of my family, they had left a mark on me that would never fade. But there was one final twist that I hadn't seen coming. As I was packing up my studio, preparing to leave the city and start fresh somewhere else, I found one last photograph, an image of me, standing in the middle of the road, surrounded by shadows. It was the final piece of the puzzle, the final clue to the mystery that had consumed my life. I was the last spirit, the last figure in the photographs. And as I looked at that image, I understood the truth. The spirits hadn't been seeking revenge or justice. They had been trying to warn me, to prepare me for what was to come. Because in the end, I wasn't the one hunting them, they were the ones hunting me. And now, they had finally claimed their prize. The camera sits on my desk, untouched for weeks. The darkroom is sealed off, the photos locked away. But no matter how hard I try, I can't escape the feeling that it's not over, that the spirits are still out there, waiting. And every time I close my eyes, I see their faces, their hollow eyes staring back at me, reminding me that some mysteries are better left unsolved. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more horror stories.